So, what happens when a country's most important document, its constitution, just starts to get tired? I know, it's a strange question, right? But it leads us to this really fascinating and honestly pretty troubling idea called the exception trap.
Okay, so let's start with what we all basically assume is true. Constitutions. They're built to last. I mean, they're designed to be these super robust documents, right? To handle conflict, to guide a country through massive change. They're supposed to be the bedrock of everything.
But what if that bedrock can actually suffer from fatigue? And I'm not talking about some sudden, dramatic collapse. I mean a slow, creeping exhaustion. So what does that even look like?
Well, it turns out a constitution's strength does have a limit. See, it's built to absorb conflict and change, sure, but it was never, ever designed for an indefinite, permanent state of exception. And that's the core tension we're going to unpack here.
So to really get how things can go so wrong, we've got to first understand how they were supposed to work in the first place. What was the original blueprint for equality?
At its heart, the promise was incredibly simple and powerful. Everyone is equal before the law. That's it. That's the fundamental rule, the North Star for the entire system.
Think of it like this. Equality was always meant to be the default setting, the norm. Exceptions, they were supposed to be tools, instruments you'd use to fix a specific problem, like a historical injustice. They were never meant to be an alternative to equality, but more like a temporary detour to get everyone to the same final destination. Real, actual justice for all.
So let's be super clear here. The original idea wasn't flawed at all. Having exceptions isn't the problem. The problem, that fatigue we were talking about, that begins when those exceptions just grow. When they multiply without ever being checked or reviewed or recalibrated against that original goal.
And this brings us to the really critical part, the process of decay. Let's dig into how these temporary tools started to harden into permanent, unmovable structures.
So it seems to happen in about 3 stages. First, the exceptions just multiply. Why? Well, because it's often politically easier to slap on a special provision than to actually fix the root problem. Then, stage 2, the courts, which are supposed to be the guardrails, they start to weaken. They shift their focus from the big principle, is this equal, to just checking boxes, was the procedure followed. And then the third, and maybe the most critical failure of all, the whole system was built on the assumption that leaders would, in good faith, periodically review these exceptions. That assumption failed. The reviews just stopped happening. And the result is, well, it's not like the rule of equality got erased from the Constitution. It's more like it got surrounded, walled off. It became this tiny island in a growing sea of exceptions, making it harder and harder for anyone to actually get to it.
And what this does is create this huge gap between what's on paper and what's happening in practice, right? So on paper, sure, equal rights exist, but in the real world, access to those rights is a whole other story. It's unequal, it's conditional, it's tangled up in this crazy web of policies. That perfect symmetry of the original promise, it's gone.
Okay, so we've seen the symptoms, we've seen how this decay happens. Now let's actually define it. Let's give this thing a name.
And remember, the problem isn't the exception itself. The problem, the trap, is the inability to exit.
And that's what we call the exception trap. It's that state where a constitutional exception becomes so politically untouchable that it's just impossible to exit. And the real irony? It ends up degrading the very equality it was originally meant to protect. So when an exception becomes a trap, you start to see these 3 things happen. First, it becomes way easier to just keep expanding the exception than to show any kind of restraint. Second, anytime someone tries to correct it or dial it back, they get accused of taking away an entitlement. And finally, equality itself stops being a real operative principle. It just becomes aspirational, something we talk about but don't actually do.
All right, so what's the real cost of all this? What's the price a society pays for falling into this trap? Because this isn't just some abstract legal debate. It has real, serious consequences for real people.
And it's so important to get this right. The Constitution itself didn't fail. The paper didn't tear. The words are all still there. What failed was the human part of the equation. The assumption, the hope, that people in power would act in good faith to correct and recalibrate the system. Constitutions are really just frameworks. They're like the blueprints for a house, but they're not the engine. They can't build the house by themselves. They need people, active, responsible leaders, to actually make it work.
So what happens when that engine fails? Well, the result isn't some big, loud revolution. It's something much quieter, and maybe even more dangerous.
It's a quiet erosion of trust.
I mean, think about the human cost here. Citizens don't go out and rebel against the Constitution. No, they do something quieter. They just stop expecting it to arbitrate fairly. They give up on the promise.
And this creates a really dangerous condition for any society: compliance without belief. People follow the rules, sure, but they don't actually believe in the system's fairness anymore. That bond, that trust between a citizen and their country, it gets severed.
So I guess I'll just leave you with this question to think about. What is more dangerous in the long run? A loud, obvious collapse that everyone can see and fight against, or a silent withdrawal? A quiet turning away, where people just stop believing in the whole project? That might be the real danger, right? What happens when the people simply stop listening?